Welcome everyone. Excuse me. We're gonna get started in just a bit. We're gonna let people kind of trickle in here for a minute. But please go ahead and rename yourself with your city or organization and pronouns, and we'll get started in a moment. And I know if you work remote or been at your desk all day, you can use this time, stretch your hands out, shake out. We're looking forward to sharing some insights today and having a conversation. So we'll give folks just a little bit more time. And then do want everyone to know, and I'll repeat this, but this meeting is being recorded. So just so you know, but go ahead, rename yourself with your organization or the city you work for, pronouns, etc. Hi, Nikisha. It's good to see you. Happy you could join us today.
Hi, glad to be here.
Happy to have you. Happy to have Sam, Kiri. Okay. Well, I know there's a couple more folks coming, but I guess we'll let them trickle in as we go. And we'll go ahead and get started. Hey, welcome, Ruth. Okay. So everyone, welcome to our community of practice on the importance of keeping data current. This is our community of practice for September. Happy to see so many familiar faces and looking forward to sharing some insights with Shar, our data scientist, and me, Samantha, your community program manager at Greenlink Analytics, and then go into a conversation. So with that, our agenda for today is that we're going to do an introduction. For some of you, this might look familiar, so I'll go through that, but it's just to give some insights to what the community of practice is, Greenlink Analytics, who we are, and our Greenlink Equity Map. And then I might share a little bit about a couple other tools really quickly before we dive into some insights on keeping data current from Shar and myself. We'll go over our data refresh that just went live in GEM. Exciting. And then we'll go into data ownership and demographics and talk about some data gaps and change over time and the importance of that connecting to keeping data current. Then we'll have some breakout room discussions for about 20 minutes, and then Shar and I will debrief what those rooms look like and then go into a Q&A before closing out our meeting today. While I'm presenting, I won't be able to see you all really well, so if you have questions, take note of them. You can add them to the chat, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. So with that, I want to welcome you all and introduce our community of practice. So this space that you're in today is a space where we connect leaders advancing environmental and social equity and learn about topics that improve our work through peer-to-peer conversations and data literacy. And this is brought to you by Greenlink Analytics community team. So you see some of us here today are facilitating and presenting. Some of us are here for support and for the conversations to be had. But this team focuses on people-first approaches in research and policymaking by fostering government-community collaboration. We work a lot with cities and CBOs and working to make sure that we humanize the data using tools like GEM by emphasizing that we are all a part of an ecosystem moving change forward. Now, Greenlink Analytics is an Atlanta-based 501c3 that focuses on energy and equity research. And we work with cities, other governmental bodies, and community-based organizations nationwide to propel our mission forward, which is together we can push forward a fast and fair clean energy transition. With that being said, we have 4 different teams that run a bunch of different tools. And we have our analyst team, our community team, us, that we've talked to briefly, our data team that Shar is part of, and then our business development team. And some of the tools we have are in the background here. You'll see our Clean Energy Jobs Calculator, an example of it. It's a new tool from our analyst team. Feel free to check out more about it on our website. We just did some updates and some cool graphics thanks to our marketing team. We have a clean energy policy toolkit and a process guide for city community collaboration that you can see here on the slide. These are free resources and downloadable from our website. The process guide does work to collaborate with GEM, but it can also be a great resource on its own. Now, for these tools here, these are tools that are focused on by other teams, and I have them in order as you see them here. So on the right below the words, you see the the ACES tool, the Advanced Clean Energy Scenarios, and this helps show city-specific electricity generation and emissions ranging from business as usual scenarios to the cleanest cost efficient options. Then we have Athenia, cool new graphic again by our marketing team that the data scientists developed and use this tool to forecast the energy grid to understand how energy systems will operate under clean scenarios, and a bunch of other cool stuff. So check out the website to learn more about that in our IAM tool, which is a building and transportation policy impact calculator that allows a deeper dive into how specific policy decisions will interact with other policies and play out over a decade. Again, I am not the experts on these tools, but I wanted to give you a sneak peek of those so you can check out more on our website. The tool that our team runs, oops, skipped ahead there, I'm sorry, is the Greenlink Equity Map. And so with this tool, we use this tool as a data visualization to create to make environmental, social, and economic data easily accessible to everyone. So over here, you'll see an example of us showing Atlanta with a grid on the other side that explains what you're seeing here. And here you're seeing energy burden efficiencies and eviction rates. And that dark yellow is going to be those who are experiencing the highest burden of this correlation. So this tool is used by over 60 cities and other governing bodies and 100 plus community-based organizations. It currently has about 750 active members and over 230 different organizations use this tool. And we just uploaded over the summer a self-onboarding feature. So again, if you have access to the tool already, awesome. If you want to learn more, I always follow up these community of practices with an email that has resources and information from us and our team. A lot of what I share today, including our slides. So you can follow up there, and our team holds office hours to have discussions. But you're not here to talk about our tools today. You're here to learn about data and keeping it current. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Shar and let her take the stage.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Shar. If we have not met before, I'm going to start off talking about our newest, I guess it's one large data set or a lot of different data sets. But basically, if you are not familiar with GEM, Samantha just mentioned it, but we used to have 2019 data in GEM, and we recently, as of 2 or 3 days ago, updated our data to 2021 data. So again, if you're familiar with GEM, we have 30 plus data sets, maybe closer to 40 now in the platform. And so what this data refresh means is that all the indicators or the data sets that we have in there are going to stay the same. They're just going to reflect the most recent data that is in there. The interface is going to stay the same, but the most important thing for you all to know probably here is that there was a big census tract boundary shift between 2019 and 2021. Namely, the census had 2010 boundaries, and with the decennial census update, we transitioned into 2020 boundaries. So what that means is that if you have, for example, census tract 100, it might be in 2020 have census tract 100.01 and 100.02. So that essentially means, that census tract is comprised of a little bit of another census tract and might have been split into two. So I think that is the most important thing to note when looking at our new data in the platform. And just generally, if you work a lot with census data, keeping note of that. There is a way to compare data between years. There are crosswalk files on the census. So we're happy to work with you all if you're working through that. But that is the most important thing to note, other than, of course, there's new updated data. And I did want to just touch on the importance of having this updated data real quick before we go into our discussion. And I pass it over to Sammy because one second. Well, it doesn't really matter. So this highlights the importance of referencing the most current data when possible. So the 2021 data does correspond to the most current data that's out from the census. So we'll be updating this each year. That's a part of my role at Greenlink. So hopefully next year we'll have 2022 data in the platform. And we'll go into a little bit of like the background of the demographics and some of the lags with this data, which is why 2021 is the most recent data that's out right now with a lot of data sets. But this is also very important because our communities are changing rapidly, and there's also a lot of gaps in this data, which Sammy and I will talk to in a minute. So it's really important to ensure that our data is refreshed, and so that we're keeping ourselves and our analyses up to date with what's happening on the ground, or able to pair this with what's happening on the ground. So now, Sammy, you can switch to the next slide. So that transitions into data ownership, which is going to be a lot of the conversation that we're having today. And having up-to-date data is kind of like one element of data ownership that we should be aware of. But what do we mean when we say data ownership? Essentially, the legal control and responsibility of data. So this implies power as well as control. Data can be owned by a person or an organization. Historically, data has been used to perpetuate inequality and discrimination, also still happens today. For example, data that was used to drive discriminatory policies like redlining in the 1930s. So it's really important to understand data ownership and like why it's important. So going into the why, one element is addressing power dynamics, but also roles. So roles of researchers versus participants in research. I can't speak to you all, but here at Greenlink, a lot of us are researchers and a lot of us do come from an academic background. And so ensuring that we understand our roles as a part of this and being able to bring in participants or understand that dynamic between those roles. Also understanding the data collection process. So the history of data collection, for example, if you're using census data, but also understanding data gaps and also being able to be transparent about that. If you're collecting data that has a lot of data gaps, maybe that's where you start figuring out how you can fill in some of those data gaps, which again, we will continue to talk through as a part of this whole discussion, but also historical use of data. So we don't exacerbate existing inequalities, and we do want to recognize and seek to correct legacies of discrimination through data. A lot of the purpose of this is to build community power, and it emphasizes the need to address systemic inequities and power imbalances that are going on. So we also want to prevent data misuse as a part of this and make sure that it does not get in the hands of bad actors. And this is also, I mentioned this already, but this is kind of where co-creation comes into play. So we can talk about this in breakout rooms, or if we just have a big group discussion, since there are a few of us here today. But Greenlink has a couple elements that we can give as an example of how we approach this. So one element is the equity index. We have some information on this on our website. We can talk more about this if you have questions, but it's essentially a scorecard that brings together a bunch of different burdens that a city might be facing that they think is important to them, or the most impactful burdens to their community, and essentially has a scorecard that ranks those burdens from 1 to 100. And so you can compare different communities and understand and kind of have a one-stop shop to understand equity for your city. But that's a co-creative process. So in order to create that scorecard and come up with what indicators, what data sets we're going to use as a part of the equity index, we bring in community buy-in and community discussion as a part of that. We also have the process guide on our website, which talks about having the importance of having community engagement and how to incorporate that into and pair that with mapping and data analysis. We also have listening tours, so not just creating data sets because we want to, but creating them because there's a need for them and community is asking for them. I know Samantha and Jelly have been leading one on the community side, and that's how we understand what indicators we want to add to the platform. And then also data sharing agreements. So if we're partnering with another organization or with a community to get a local data set or a data set that we have not created that's not publicly available, really understanding like that dynamic of how we're acquiring that data and how we are being transparent with the data acquisition methods, but also like helping our partners understand how we're going to use that data and how we're going to publicize it, if we're going to publicize it at all. So I think that those are some elements to start those brain juices, get those brain juices flowing for our breakout rooms, because we'll pose some questions to you all of how you're thinking about this as well, and like maybe some examples so we can learn from you all as well. Okay, next slide, Sammy. Okay, so before I pass it on to Sammy, I'm going to start talking a little bit about data gaps, and I think that a lot of that starts with understanding census data and where demographic data comes from. So a lot of Greenlink's data is from the census. So the American Community Survey, or ACS, if you all have heard of that, is a lot of where we get our data. We have a lot of different data sources, but this is a huge one. And I know this might be one that some of you might use as well. But it's important to understand the history of this survey. So for example, just for context setting, different groups of people have been traditionally underrepresented as a part of the survey, as a part of the census. And it was not until 1960 that people could actually select their own race as a part of the survey. It was actually like chosen for them. So I think that's important context when approaching this data set already, but also understanding why it's conducted or why it's posted with the lag. So it's conducted annually, but there's a lot of data cleaning as a part of this that the census goes through. So as a result, it is posted with the lag. So it's 2024, and we just posted 2021 data. Especially, there's an extra lag if the census is posting data, and then you have a group like ourselves that's trying to translate the information to kind of repost it. So then there's an extra lag going on there. So that's important to note. And also the census data is disaggregated by race, but not by ethnicity. So it makes it harder for people to answer some of these survey questions because we all don't really fit in a box, and no one wants to fit in a box. And we're all very, we have a lot of mixed races and stuff like that. And so really understanding that as well. So there might be some gaps in the data related to race as well. And then the last piece here is hard to count populations. So these are people that are in hard to reach places, unhoused people, those facing language barriers, those that have prior distrust of the government, maybe people with disabilities. All of these people are highly unlikely to participate in the survey and like even answer a knock on their door. And so that's also really important to note as a data gap as a part of this. So that orange highlighted point is really like the takeaway here is we need to complement a lot of this data with local information to get more granular contextual insights and paint a more colorful story. Sammy's going to talk a little bit about like intersectionality as well, and we can get into that in our breakout rooms, but really understanding not having like a binary lens to all of this, but making sure that we're pairing data with ground truth information, community engagement, or just other data sets. So a lot of pieces in GEM that yellow, blue, green map that Sammy was showing earlier really shows like the intersection to understand, okay, now we're not just looking at energy burden, but we're like looking at energy burden paired with other health indicators to say, okay, energy burden is really high in Southwest Atlanta, but if we pair this with asthma rates as well, maybe we really need to start focusing efforts in the east side of Atlanta or something like that. So really trying to like understand data from like a dynamic viewpoint and bringing in other data sets. So I will stop there and pass it to Sunil.
Awesome. Thank you, Shar. So building off this context and getting our critical thinking caps ready, let's talk about why we need to get more granular and questions to be asking to understand why data gaps exist and how they might be showing up in our work and what they might be. So brief, since we welcome folks at all levels of their learning journey, data gaps, Shar talked to it a bit, and I'll just add on to it. Data gaps are referring to missing data about any particular area of interest as well as communities. In context here, we're speaking to the missing voices of community and community members in the data. And it's important, as Shar was outlining more technically, to remember that data is collected by people, for people, and can drive many changes. but it can also contain many biases. So what are some of the reasons data gaps exist, and what is data telling us? We aren't here to give you answers because we don't have all of them, as the answers will be particular to your communities and their histories, but we are here to give insights and generate conversation and continued conversation as thought partners in this space. So with that, on the slide, I have some of these questions thinking about this, like whose stories are told in the data? How are stories being used to drive policy and share community lived experiences? And whose stories are often missing in the data? Some examples are like Shar was talking to, multiracial community identities, those who have intersectional identities and, you know, might be Greek and Native American, or Asian and white. And when I say Asian, there's a lot more to that I will talk about in a second. And there's those with disabilities or and our marginalized communities. So with that, is there a reason it's hard to collect the data, and why are these community stories missing? Who is collecting the data? Who is participating, and what are the barriers? Might be some questions to help answer that. And with the barriers, some examples of that are language, as Shar brought up earlier, time, resources, and trust, to name a few, because as we know, trust is a really huge barrier. And if you have minimal resources, you aren't going to show up if you don't trust that your voice is going to make a difference. So again, thinking about the data you use or work with, whose histories are being told and whose aren't. Histories and stories doesn't just speak to the past, but it speaks to the present, and it speaks to that future. And so with that being said, change over time. Is looking at this something that can help us close gaps? And how are things changing over time? So some examples that I wanted to share with you all today is the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition has been doing research for years on boarding schools. There's been a call in Native communities to for a lot of healing, and you're seeing a lot of movement around today that as a child, I don't know if I could have ever imagined happening. But with that came September 30th is now National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, or known as Orange Shirt Day. And that's to commemorate the heartbreaking traumas that Indigenous communities, their children, experienced in boarding schools as they were stolen from their families, forced into schools, and started school around this time. Now, with that, there's a lot more history that I won't go into, but going back to the National Native American Boarding Schools Healing Coalition, they've been doing all this research, and some data sets have just come out highlighting over 523 boarding schools and experiences and community stories. And boarding schools, again, it's not just past, it's present and future, because boarding schools had been around since the 1800s to present day. So let that sink in as something that's potentially leading to closing this gap. There's laws around content accessibility. And when I think about that, it's not just in the remote world, there's also laws around accessibility when it comes to building performance standards. So now you have ramps in places, elevators, you have on buses and trains, the lifts that comes down to help those with accessible disabilities get on to transportation. Within the online sphere, websites, there's a lot of regulation and rules and ways to make it more accessible through visualization, as well as text and audio options. I know in Zoom, there's a lot of features now where you can work with translators to have multiple language options so folks can participate from all over, as language is oftentimes a barrier to participation or accessing knowledge in workshops. We also have mental health data. I think that's a very big win, not thinking of just the physicality, but what is some of those emotional components that affect people and lead to a lot of different decisions. So are things improving? Are they creating more divide? What is happening over time? And how hasn't things changed over time? So another example is, I don't know how many folks know about the Invisible Women's Act, but this act is related to MMIP, MMIW, and MMIR. Now, these are all acronyms meaning missing, murdered, Indigenous people, women, relatives. And there's been a call for more data. And this has been going on since before the act even happened. And we're starting to see a little bit of movement, but there still hasn't been a lot of collecting accurate data and keeping track of this in support with, again, police forces oftentimes a barrier in this where they don't always accurately depict or catch what's going on or won't respond quickly. In some areas, it's improving. There's the Feather Act in San Diego, or the Feather Response in San Diego, where police are responding specifically for MMIP options. But how is that data being collected and tracked? And then when we look at our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, as I mentioned in the last slide, bringing that back up here, there is a huge diversity within our Asian American Pacific Islanders communities that is not being tracked in the census. There's also sometimes some dispute about how the census is being used if you check this box, and how resources that are needed by some communities aren't getting to them. Another thing to mention with this is that it's over 2/3 of API, excuse me, Asian American Pacific Islander communities is easier to say for me, but they speak another language that isn't English at home. And so again, that goes back to potential language barriers or understanding barriers to keep in mind. So with all of that, and I'll share some research and some links related to everything I talked about today, but this is just, again, setting up that stage to talk about and learn, like, how is data important? How is updates in data important for driving change and understanding what is and what isn't changing? And is that helpful to understand? I also wanted to throw a little gem out here for all of you who are here today, but I run our pipeline for GEM, and we've heard a lot of call for change over time. And so that's the next indicator in the pipeline that we're working to see how this can happen and what's going on. So that's something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about, because historically it's hard to look at change over time. You can look at different indicators and understand a story now, but if you want to look at a story from the 1800s to today, there's some cool resources that have like the history, but what about those data points to help with your policy drive, to help with your grant funding, to help with your research, to help encourage and inspire future generations, as well as the fact that why is that changing over time, I think, is a great question, and won't go into too much detail again. But another thing is we're seeing this huge push towards Indigenous knowledge and methodologies to help support with a lot of natural catastrophe and management of land. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking, and we're going to give you all space to have a discussion with each other and with us to expand on, and it can start with, what are your thoughts around what's being said today? What are your questions? And since we're a small group, I don't think we'll go into breakout rooms. Char Jelly, does that sound? We'll just stay in a room together today? Yeah, okay. So we'll have a discussion here. We have about 20 minutes for this discussion. And I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts or insights or questions within your own work. And with that being said, I guess I'll start with a question to you all. If you have other insights, please go ahead and share. But we're wondering, like, where do you see data gaps in your work? And if you want to expand on that and maybe introduce yourself, since we're such a small group, with your name, organization you work for, and maybe something you love about fall. So, does someone want to volunteer to go first?
I can go first.
Thank you, Kiri.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Carrie Brennan. I'm with the City of Austin. I work within the public utility, so Austin Energy. One thing I love about fall is the cooler temperatures and changing leaves. Nice to be able to get outside and enjoy it, especially here in Austin, Texas, where it's always hot. I appreciate you sharing the unincorporated areas within jurisdictions. That's been a challenge working in a city where we have interlocal agreements within the counties. Our department doesn't always have the same service territory as other city departments. We work in outside of Travis County as well. So that has been challenging as we're comparing data sets. And also we collect different data across departments as you get into the disaggregation and race and ethnicity. So it's challenging, or we're collecting by zip code and not by census tract or block. And so there's always some manipulating that has to be done, and an additional lag.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Carrie. That's really insightful. And I'm out here in San Diego and always thinking about those unincorporated areas and how do we get to working with them.
Well, I should have said good morning to you then.
Yes, it is still morning here. That's okay. I'm used to being between the two. Yeah, but who would like to go next, or did Kiri, you want to popcorn it to someone?
I can go ahead and go because I probably will have to leave a little bit early to teach. But I'm Fuchsia Hoover. I'm a professor at University of North Carolina in Charlotte, and my favorite thing about fall is probably the outfits. Yeah, I feel like the cooler weather. I don't know. I think I just feel more creative in the fall, and that comes through like in my clothing as well, and just like uh yeah, being able to kind of express myself in a different way. And I also am a big fan of like earth tones and the colors of fall. I grew up in Minnesota, so the color changing of the leaves is also like one of the highlights I think for the year for me. So. And I'm still thinking about data gaps, so I'll come back to that question.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I agree. Fall clothes are awesome in colors, and I am a crock pot, so I like to simmer on things. And I know you mentioned you have to leave early, so I just want to emphasize: if you think of questions, feel free to raise your hand or interrupt, and we'll get to them. But also, please follow up with email, because these conversations don't stop here. Like, we want to keep having these conversations and build our community and network who's sharing all the resources and info.
Awesome. Thank you. Good to know.
All right.
Hi everyone, Nikisha Glover from Charlotte, North Carolina, with Indie Group Services. And I will say one of my favorite person's birthdays is in fall. That's my granny, and she's gonna be turning 90 this year, so it'll be extra special this year. And then that also reminded me of how probably since my son was born, we've been on or around her birthday, been going to the mountains to pick apples. And I say that with air quotes because when we go to the mountains, like they're in the store and we pick them out the store. But we get apples each year and all the different varieties of the apples and stuff. Um, and as I think about data gaps, I sit from a perspective as I consider myself an environmental justice practitioner, having come through a organizer path, working with communities directly. And the huge gap I see is data being accessible, data being in a usable format for communities to be able to advocate for themselves. I'll also add that there is a skill gap. I think communities desire to access the data for themselves as well. However, with lack of training opportunities to skill up and apply it to their real world needs, that's a gap. And then also I think sometimes there are discrepancy isn't the word I want to use, but like the difference from like those who have been trained up in data and have the research background and expertise and their skill, and actually the and them doing the research on questions that the community isn't asking versus like the community having a need, having questions, but not having a place or a source directly to attain that particular resource. So I think they're and I'm referencing like an experience I had years ago. I think these folks were sitting for their PhD, if I'm not mistaken. But I was a part of a panel, and I just remember being in that room, and the researchers in that room, although they were done well, like the research that they were presenting on things that the community wasn't asking them to resolve. So I think like really connecting those who may be going down the research track with real world needs, like immediate needs or whatnot, could be a gap that should be closed. And I'll close with that.
Yeah, Nikisha, I really appreciate that insight and that share. And it's really true. There's oftentimes a gap in academia and the rush to get your degree versus the insightful like capability of being able to connect what you're doing in the work and the foundational learning as the student you're making to the communities you're living amongst and working with and seeing on the day to day. So that is definitely a really important gap to keep in mind. And yeah, I think I don't know. Well, I'm gonna let Ruth go, but I was curious because we have I've been in the teaching space before, and I'm always wondering how do you close those gaps? But I've never been at a high level teaching, so it'd be interesting to talk to more professors about that. Not gonna put you on the spot, Fuchsia, but was curious about that. All right, Ruth, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk to you? And it's good to see you again too.
Likewise. Hey, y'all. I'm Ruth Abraham. I am in Atlanta, Georgia. My favorite thing about fall is I wrote down scents. Warm apple cider and cinnamon are like highly associated with this time of year, and of course the colors. It's a good season that we're transitioning into, but we're getting a lot of rain as of late. But as far as keeping data current, not currently working with communities, but we're seeing sustainability reporting in the corporate sphere suffers a lot from being able to even benchmark their current status in the environmental space. And so starting with just that and then working towards going on and being able to repeat and replicate that year over year is super important. So establishing frameworks that start to include communities in their conversations early on, because social goals are just as important as your environmental or emissions reduction goals, which seem to be overemphasized in this space, is something that I've been prioritizing, at least in my small contribution to the work that I've been a part of so far, but happy to be here.
Appreciate that share, Ruth. And every contribution is much larger than I think you think. So just want to emphasize that. I appreciate you all for sharing that. And Jelly Shar, I don't know if you two want to add anything. Jelly didn't see this presentation before, so.
I think that there's a lot of data gaps as we're hearing and others express, and this is something that we get the privilege of actually working with intimately here at Greenlink and trying to figure out ways to address those, and knowing that, as Samantha says, that there are limitations to our powers to that. So really it's about bringing those of us who not only can clearly see where the gaps are, but I think be able to ideate and envision ways to actually close those gaps, and to realize better ways of having data ownership and data sovereignty be part of the main norm, if you will, to be the dominant narrative, rather than having a lot of these top-down ways of data collection, interpretation, and narrative. but my work is primarily on the interpretation and narrative side. So I think I will speak from the perspective that data gaps do hurt the narrative. And Samantha has a really good, actually a written piece that she wrote in conjunction with this presentation about how when we have missing data and gaps in data, there are communities whose narratives actually get omitted a lot from the conversation, especially in the climate space when, we always say that, data is not going to create policy, but you won't pass policy without it. And it's really important to know how much that has an influence on our work. And so without those numbers, it really does matter of who's actually getting the focus, who's being highlighted in these conversations around data. And to be able to be intentional about understanding, as Shar mentioned earlier, the biases that are within it and how we deconstruct those from a narrative standpoint moving forward, and where those narratives land in policy, in research, right, publications, and the general public, and how each of those spaces matter to really tie our understandings of each other and of the problems that we're solving. So being in a data heavy space such as climate it's kind of always difficult to have people like take a step back rather than continue to move forward very quickly so that we can get the communication right. And I think that that's a piece of it is also that's connected to this, is that being able to speak honestly about the nuance of our experience and identity that you so eloquently put earlier, Samantha, I think is a really critical thing to think about when we don't have data or when we do have it, and what our responsibility is with it. So something I add.
I appreciate that share, Jelly, in addition to the conversation.
Yeah, I think I listed a lot of my thoughts during my piece of the presentation, but I think as a part of data gaps, I think also thinking from like the technical point, because I think we have a lot of narrative based and bringing in community points, but like during presentations that we've had related to maps and statistical analysis that are catered to community, we've gotten a lot of questions regarding like how do you how are you acquiring this data? Like, how do you know this about me? All of those questions. So being able to really be able to like, I think I mentioned this in the presentation, but being able to really understand the data that we're using. So like our roles as researchers is to be able to like break down and like be that middleman between the data source and the people to really understand where this data is coming from and what the data gaps are, and being able to translate it in a way that community can understand, and also trying to acquire more local data sets as well. So like partnering with community-based organizations and pairing that with open source information as well, and then obviously pairing that with like narrative that we're hearing. I will pose the next question for you guys. Yeah, citizen science all the way. The next question we have is, how are you working to address these gaps that you all mentioned in your work? So we would love to hear like some project examples or some ways that you all have approached this.
I mean, I think from a research perspective, I guess I'll kind of tie both the first and second question together. I think there's certainly a desire from faculty, not everybody, but I'm part of a center in my department that's focused on trying to do more participatory, like action, community-based research, community science. And I think a lot of the challenges is, trying to establish that relationship first, and trying to balance, the time it takes to establish the relationship and the research with like obligations from the university side of kind of the benchmarks that we're supposed to hit for publications, or demonstrating like how we are being productive outside of teaching. And so I think a lot of faculty run into that as a barrier because those timelines don't match. And so I think that's one challenge. But I think a lot of people just don't know where to start or don't know like how to connect. Or what does that mean? Like you all talked about data sovereignty, right? And negotiating who owns the data afterwards or what can be done with the data, I think can sometimes be sometimes have some tensions, especially if it's data that you're supposed to like publish from or use. But I think one of the things that I've been, I don't know, maybe overwhelmed or thinking about a lot is like both the overwhelming amount of data that we have access to and the unavailable local data that really reflects like personal experiences or things happening, that are smaller at the census level, right? Like that are actually neighborhood level or within very specific communities, right? Like even thinking about unincorporated communities, like, it may only be a couple hundred folks, maybe a couple thousand. But so like on one hand, there's so many different like there's EJ Screen. North Carolina's developing their own like EJ system, like Samantha, you're in California, there's a Cal Screen, right? Like, so there's that. Then there's other EPA tools. And they have all of these things built in and social vulnerability index. But I think like when I'm trying to understand what's happening at the ground level, like that's actually representing more of people's like individual experiences or exposures to things, that is always hard for me to find. Like even in Charlotte, thinking about like air quality monitoring, like we don't, there isn't a dispersed network where I could pull that up to actually see, how does it compare like for residents by just going within a 10 block radius. And then I think if we want to compare across regions, right? Like thinking about, I guess I'm thinking a lot about like organizing and like the power of also doing things like collectively, right? So like I think underreporting and under representation of places like unincorporated cities and towns, but then also that's the case across the country, right? So like if we're trying to figure out what are the things that like every unincorporated community is dealing with and what are some of the differences, there's no way to like collect, like there's nothing that like has that available. And I know it can be tough, you brought up the challenges of people being like, how did you get my information? Or aggregating is also protective. But yeah, I think trying to find like some of the nuances has been one of the biggest challenges I've found to really be able to say like, these Black residents here, like this is what they're dealing with, and it's different than the residents that are in this section of the city. And so yeah, I don't know, that was kind of a lot all at once. Hopefully it makes sense.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. It made a lot of sense. Jelly, go ahead and then I'll go book out.
Yeah, no, I wanted to quickly actually engage in what a lot of Fisha was bringing up, because I think that there is a lot of systemic and structural things that you were highlighting that I think are really important. A couple of the things that you mentioned was like just structurally and systemically how we like use data in relationship to time and projects, especially in the academic world, and not having that time, as I mentioned earlier, to actually take a step back and be like, well, how do we how do we use this effectively and ethically when I'm having to meet these markers and I have to move forward? Because also the research I'm doing is needed and necessary, you know, but I need to be have going through an equitable process as much as I can through a rigid timeline. So I definitely hear that. And then along with that, I was hearing you say that, you know, like there's an overwhelming amount of tools, which helped me reflect on the fact that, like, yeah, we hear that all the time as well. Like we work with a lot of city and state jurisdictions that have their own GIS mapping departments. There's a lot of tools, but not a lot of cohesion of those tools. Not a lot of intersectional understanding of what those tools do for one another or with one another. Like you were saying, even like taking a grassroots principle or organizing principle of collective action and being able to bring those tools together to move off, like build off each other. And that's something that we also see. So I wanted to bring that to the forefront here. And then the last thing that I heard you said, and because this is also a conversation about what we're doing to address some of these gaps. So about like getting more granular at the neighborhood level data and like really understanding the nuances. One of the things that we are working on to adopt more and practice more within our organization, within our team, is something that Shar mentioned very briefly, which is around an equity index, which is actually a qualitative and quantitative way of showcasing data as perceived by the community, not as we perceive it as researchers. And one of the ways to actually capture, like you're saying, how they feel an intensity of something or frequency of something, what they see as prioritization of what that actually means, versus us just saying like, yes, they have high energy burdens, but you know, so maybe we should focus our time there, but what does that mean? How do they feel? Like, to what degree do they feel like they're being impacted by that? Because it's one thing to put a number to it, and it's another thing to put a sentiment to it. And so being able to quantify subjectivity actually is like something that we are trying to do, bringing in that qualitative and making that as valuable as quantitative, but then also, again, kind of trying to take away our step away from kind of the sociologist perspective of like, I'm observing you, let you observe you, and let me help you quantify that and then reflect that accurately. So like there's through those participatory methods that you mentioned, we are trying to do something like that where it is really the community perception, not just ours. So just some bringing that forward. But there was also, again, I was going to transition also, Sammy, to a great question in the chat from Ruth about, and curious also Shar's and Sammy's answers to this around any significant changes in the data insights that for the communities that we've been working with since we've actually updated the data to the new 2021 data. Have there been any notable successes from it?
Yeah, I can start us off with that. There's actually, so we actually just finished creating the 2021 data. So we just posted it. And so we've done like the QA and the validation and stuff like that. But in terms of actually understanding the difference between 2019 data and 2021 data, we're still looking into that. And I think a lot of that is because a lot of the census tract boundaries changed. So not having like as much of like the one-to-one way to compare the information is like a little bit of a roadblock, which is also like in a way a data gap. Back to this discussion too, is like trying to compare and like having like they have the boundary changes based on like the population shifts between the decennial census every 10 years, but then also like there being a roadblock in terms of the analysis needed to try to compare these different years. So I think that is one difference. We're also like there has been a little bit of a shift based on what I've seen from 2019 to 2021. It's not crazy drastic, but I think it also depends on obviously GEM is national, and my expertise is just in Atlanta really, because that is where I live. So I understand like the dynamics of the city a little bit more. But we're seeing like a little bit of a change in especially like median income levels, a little bit in the number of households that we're seeing in different communities, but also namely 2019 versus 2021, COVID was right in the middle of all of that. So a lot of people didn't really move during that. So I think that's also a really big thing to think about, and that I'm still doing research about, because I know there was a huge lag, a larger lag in the posting of the 2020 and 2021 data sets because of COVID. So they initially posted some estimates, but then realized, those were a little bit off because a lot of people weren't answering their doors or answering mail or anything like that during COVID. And so the shifts that we're seeing are, like a little bit of like demographic shifts and stuff like that, but anything too drastic based on like the data that I've been looking at. I am curious if you all's insights as you look at it from your cities, though, if you're seeing anything that you're like, ooh, this is a big difference. We would love to know that, because that's a part of like the quality assessment that we can't necessarily do by just looking at the data year over year. It's really helpful to have that insight from you guys saying, oh yeah, we did, this whole community was built in the year of 2019. And now people moved into here. Like that's really helpful for us to know as we validate some of this information as well. And then to Sammy's point earlier, we will be launching change over time information. So we are trying to figure out, ways where we can post data potentially all the way back to 2013. So you all can look at 2019 versus 2021 data. It'll be a little bit tough because of the census tract boundary changes, but at least, you can kind of look at the general maps side by side and kind of see how that might look, and how those differences might affect your cities and the maps. And that won't be posted until January, but yeah, until then, if you guys have any insights, we would love to hear. I will let my team add to that.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, go ahead.
I know we got about 5-ish minutes left, but I wanted to add on for this question because there are some. Oh yeah, we started a little late. I'm sorry. But for this question, we had just really quick. I know I was looking at San Diego yesterday, and Chula Vista is an area where we've seen a lot of bird, and I was showing it to my friend the other day with the updates, and she was like, "Oh, this looks a lot different than it did before." So that's something I haven't had a chance to talk to Shar or the team about, but that's something I'm curious to look at more as I'm looking at San Diego more in depth in the different areas we have out here. And a lot of the issues I was hearing with research, I know we also hear a lot when it comes to funding or grants, like where you have to meet certain deadlines or do particular things. I'm sure everyone in this room has a little experience with that, and how to make sure that projects can adapt and change over time with folks. Since Jelly reminded me we only have 2 minutes left, I lost my other thoughts. But I wanted to thank you all for attending today, and please, please, please do know that this conversation does not end here. I'm sure we have a lot more to talk about. Kiri, I would have loved to connect you and Fuchsia more to talk about what she was talking about with incorporated areas and some of the solutions you have. And would really like to talk to you more as I've been seeing things in San Diego change, and like we were talking about, different areas take different approaches, because we have different resources, but we also have different communities and they need different things. And so we're going to come at it from these different perspectives and angles based on that. And that's why, as I said earlier, we don't have the answers, because it's going to depend on our communities that we're working with for a lot of these questions and information. So again, thank you all, Ruth, Kiri, Nikisha. Really appreciated the conversation today and hope to have it again. If you have any questions, please do reach out to us, and I will follow up with this recording as well as more information offline, probably later next week. And then want to say a special thanks to Shar for helping me present and sharing insights about the new data refresh and all the information there, as well as our teams. We have a list of teams here on the slide that we work with. T-Tech is one of the ones who helps GEM keep running. So really want to appreciate them and all of you for being here with us today. I'll stay on for 5 more minutes if anyone has a question offline, but I appreciate you all again and hope you have a beautiful day, and stay safe if you're in Atlanta.
Thanks, Sammy.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ruth, good to see you.
Same here. Bye, you guys.
Thank you.